And go to the next slide. Yeah. And I'll be admitting people as we do this too. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the September 2021 meeting of the Human Trafficking Task Force of Southern Colorado. I'm glad to welcome you here in person as well as online. It's an exciting thing to attempt. We don't know how it's going to go, so just bear with us. My name is Julie Beller, and I am the chair for the board of directors for this organization. We've been around for about 14 years, been having meetings for that long and all of our awareness events. It's good to be back in a room with human beings and not in my living room talking to a screen by myself. Although I'm still glad that those of you online are still able to join us. I know that we have people still coming in from Texas, Ohio, and some other states. So it's exciting to continue and try to figure out how we can invite people from even around the world if they wanted to join us. So yeah, we're still going to figure this out. A couple of housekeeping items that I usually do when we're just online, but I'm going to say it to you guys again. We always ask that you stay muted during our meeting, especially now that we're doing this hybrid thing. It'll just help us keep things running smoother. If you have questions, for those of you online, please send those to host Leona Straight. She'll gather those for us, and then she'll be able to ask our speaker those questions at the end of his presentation. So at the beginning of a private chat to host Leona Straight, write the word question all in caps so that she can kind of keep track of those. We'll have people here in the room able to ask questions as well, but Leona will be doing those for us online. I think that's it for those parts. Our task force, as most of you in this room know, is a grassroots, all volunteer-based, stay in the camera, organization that is focused on prevention of human trafficking through awareness and advocacy in our community. Our founder got us started about 14 years ago when she found out about human trafficking that was happening overseas. She learned about it, and then she realized if it's happening over there, it's happening here. And she wanted to bring awareness to our community, was passionate about it, and that's how we got started. And it's really an honor to be a part of this organization that has been involved in this community for so long. Our vision, as you can see on your screens, is to end modern day slavery in Southern Colorado. And our mission is preventing labor and sex trafficking through awareness and advocacy, intervening in the human trafficking cycle through collaboration with individuals, agencies, and organizations, and connecting those impacted by modern day slavery to restorative services. What we do, monthly meetings, and even through the pandemic, we ran our meetings. There was just a couple of months that we missed because we didn't know how to run an online meeting, but we figured that out and kept it going. The point of these meetings is for you guys to meet each other, especially when we're in person, to network with the other organizations that are involved, like Saxon and Vaquita Mountain Home, and the organization formerly known as Restore Innocence, so that we can get to know each other. How can we support one another? How do I volunteer? How do I learn more about human trafficking? That is the goal of these meetings. Community presentations. Our former board member, Lisa Brandt, is still chair of the presentations committee. If you want a presentation done to a small group, a large group, a school, a church, reach out to us and we will be able to organize that for you. Just a basic HT 101. We're happy to interact with big and small groups. Our annual symposium is coming up soon, and I think there's a slide for that in just a bit. We've been having those annual symposiums since the very beginning. That was one of the first things that we started to bring a large scale awareness event to our community. When it works out, we have Advocacy Day at the Capitol. The past few years, we've just ran into some issues, one of them being a pandemic. So we haven't been able to hold Advocacy Day at the Capitol, and we're trying to revision what that might look like. If you're interested in joining us in that effort, also reach out to us, like people wanting presentations. We have a diversion program, which we partner with the 4th Judicial District Attorney's Office for individuals who have been arrested on charges of prostitution. If they are found to be if they fit our program, if they will attend 4 sessions with us, we do a needs assessment, and then the next 3 sessions, we format off what we find in those needs assessments. And if they will fulfill all of those, we are able to work with the district attorney's office and have their record expunged. That's huge, because when you go to apply for a job and they do a background check and they see that you've been arrested on charges of prostitution, it's highly likely, unless your employer is amazing, that you're not going to get that job. And that stays with you for a very long time. So that's one of the purposes of that program, and it's one of my favorites. And we also do survivor support. So sometimes we'll have CSPD reach out to us and say, hey, we have somebody in a bad situation, they need to move apartments, or we need somebody that needs a gift card for food, or whatever that need might be. Any money that's donated to us, we can put in that survivor fund and immediately meet those needs. So that's what we do. I shouldn't have showed that slide yet, Mandy. So next we have Miss Mandy, who's going to come and give us an announcement about the organization formerly known as Restore Innocence. You can just hit the arrow when you're ready.
Okay. So let's see. I can't tell if I'm in the camera or not, but we will say that I am. So Restore Innocence, or the organization formerly known as Restore Innocence, had an amazing celebration dinner on Sunday, and we had over 150 people that came, and we were just totally blessed by how generous they were. And so a lot of those funds are going to be going towards housing. If any of you that are involved directly with survivors know that, for one thing, housing is difficult right now anyway, for those of us just trying to be on the the normal path, whatever that is. But for them, it's even harder. And so we are looking at finding a couple of places, whether that's 2 apartments or a duplex or a house that can be rented by 2 separate people, so that we can house some of our survivors who really need some place to go and cannot find what they're looking for. So that is what we were asking for, and God totally blessed that. It was amazing. And so also our new name, which is what we introduced there, we were celebrating 10 years of being an organization. It's actually been a little bit more than that, but that's what we were celebrating. And so we changed the name. We changed it because we were hearing feedbacks from survivors. They don't really like the innocence part, especially. They don't feel like they can be innocent anymore. There can be a few sides to that, but they really just don't feel like that. And so we decided that we would go away from that, along with our logo, the colors. Those were all really not what is survivor led. So we have changed our name, just this arrow, to Reclaiming Hope. And so now we have the wings, and we're hoping that that will really make them feel a little bit more comfortable and like we're more welcoming. So we will be getting started more with housing and things like that. One of the things that we gave out, so if you are in person or if you see one of us soon, we have some of these left that we're giving out. So these are these cute little, I don't know if you can see it, googly eyes that go over your webcam, because that is one thing that is a little tricky with internet safety. So we've talked with people, and so if you cover it, you might not be able to see me. There you go. Just with these little googly eyes that have our new name on it. So I'll give them to people who are here, and if you see any of us soon, we will have a few extras to give to you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Mandy. I was at that event. It was a great event attended by a lot of people. Nice to see the community coming together again in different ways, especially for a celebration of 10 years, 10 and a little bit more years of hard work. And kudos to you guys for listening to what survivors had to say. I know that even when we were redoing our logo, like I was looking up the different psychological meanings of colors and shapes, and getting feedback on what that means. It's important to listen to what survivors have to say to us. So I guess I could say welcome to Reclaiming Hope. Next is our symposium happening on October 23rd. And it's focused on illicit massage businesses, which we have a lot of here in our community, and labor trafficking in Colorado. For many years, almost all of our symposiums have focused on sex trafficking, which is highly prevalent. And there are a lot of needs, but we've always tried to figure out ways to incorporate what is happening, really what is happening with labor trafficking. And as there has been news stories and we find out more about the number, there's 20 some odd illicit massage businesses right here in El Paso County, which is a high number for the size of city that we are. How do we address these? And how do we push on county officials? How do we push on a mayor? How do we push on the county commissioners so that we can pass ordinances that will make a difference in helping those things get closed down, and for the survivors that are living in those to get services that they need? Many of those individuals have been here a long time. It's the only thing they've ever known. So closing those things down and not having something to offer for them is really not an option. So we're looking forward to having discussions on October 23rd. You can go to our website to register and find more information on that. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. And as I do that, Christian, I am going to unmute you, I think.
Let me unmute myself. Hopefully that works.
There you go. That works.
Okay.
Is your camera on by chance?
It is, yes. I'm seeing it on my end, but I think it's just about how you project it there.
Okay, I'll have Joey fix that, but I'll introduce you really quickly. Christian Gardner-Wood is a senior deputy district attorney for the 1st Judicial District and the director of community protection and legislative affairs. He's also the current chair for the Colorado Human Trafficking Council, which was put in place by Governor Hickenlooper and has continued since. Christian graduated from the University of Colorado Law School in 2007 and has spent his career serving in the 1st Judicial District. Christian has served at the as a human trafficking prosecutor, and in that position, he prosecutes all human trafficking cases for the district, works on legislation and policy regarding human trafficking, and he does presentations in the community about human trafficking. Christian, I'm so glad that you were able to be here with us this evening, even virtually. It's nice to have a speaker who is able to be with us. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say about all the things that you're involved in human trafficking wise, but also updating us on legislation that we need to be aware of. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with the task force and be here with you tonight. One clarification I want to make: I spent the first 12 years of my career in the 1st Judicial District, but have been in the Boulder County DA's office, the 20th Judicial District, as Director of Community Protection and Legislative Affairs there for just coming up on 3 years next month, but still involved in human trafficking, serve as the Colorado District Attorney's Council representative to the Colorado Human Trafficking Council, and I'm honored to have been elected now twice by the council, by vote of the council, to be chair of the council. So I'm in my 2nd term, I think 3rd year as chair of the council, and I think 5th year on the council, representing district attorneys and prosecutors and law enforcement within the realm of human trafficking, and really getting to know the different service providers across the state, the different task forces, such as the Human Trafficking Task Force of Southern Colorado, which is well represented on our Human Trafficking Council. And so thank you so much for that, certainly. I don't have a formalized presentation today. What I wanted to do was, I was just asked to do a update for you all about legislation from the past session. One of the things that the council does is keeps track of legislation that we are doing statewide within the realm of human trafficking. One of my jobs within the district attorney's office is actually to be down at the Capitol on a regular basis and to advocate for various bills, including human trafficking bills, those affecting vulnerable populations, and of course, criminal justice bills that are down there. So I give every several months an update to the council on legislative policy that's potentially coming up and that has been introduced and has been passed into law. So I was asked specifically today to talk to you all about this past general session and the laws that were passed there. One thing I will say, and it goes to what you just heard from your chairperson, is what we have this session is we didn't have anything specifically saying it was human trafficking related. We have in years past. I think we've done a great job as a state to amend our trafficking laws, to continually look at it to make sure that we're at the forefront of combating human trafficking. But what we know beyond that is there's various forms of trafficking, both within sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and various levels of exploitation that happen within the context of trafficking and the vulnerable populations that are vulnerable for trafficking. So even though this session, we didn't have a specific bill that was entitled human trafficking or was directly on point, there's a lot of bills that impact the work that we do as service providers, community members, law enforcement, counselors, therapists, et cetera, that really impact this realm of work. And so what I've been asked over the last several years by the council is to kind of take a broad look at legislation that's being passed in the state of Colorado that impacts the work that we are doing in the anti-human trafficking field. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Some of this may be not as focused on the work that you're doing. Some of you may find that it's really in line with the work you're doing. And that's kind of the idea behind kind of taking this broad approach to looking at legislation and looking at what we're doing, particularly within that continuum of human trafficking and continuum of vulnerability that impacts the clients and survivors and folks that we serve. So with that, I'll kind of jump into some of the bills that we were tracking and talk about them. I certainly welcome any questions that you may have around that. Some of these I know much more in depth than others, to be honest with you. So I followed all of these, but some of these I actually was involved in helping draft and testified on at the state legislature. So some of those I can talk about in quite a bit of depth, where others, it's really more just surface review of what happened at the Capitol. So one that actually came out of my office that I helped draft was a change to the extortion law in Colorado, the criminal extortion law and penalties for that. What we were finding is within the realm, particularly of labor trafficking, we would have individuals who would use somebody's immigration status against them and maybe not force work and maybe not get to a true level of labor trafficking, but rather somebody was working and they were doing so consensually and they were expecting to be paid at the end. What we were successful of 2 or 3 sessions ago was to bolster our wage theft statutes, because as I see it in that labor trafficking continuum, we have wage theft, which doesn't rise to the level of labor trafficking because person is engaging in the work and doing so knowingly and voluntarily, but with an expectation of pay at the end and fair pay and appropriate pay at the end. And people weren't paying on the back end. That unfortunately didn't fit within the realm of labor trafficking because we didn't have that force, fraud, or coercion in the front end to get the person to do the work. So we bolstered our wage theft laws several sessions ago, which I think has been helpful in that realm. But we're also finding more recently is that individuals would tell our victims or these workers, well, that's all fine and well that I didn't pay you, but you can't report to law enforcement because I'll report your immigration status to ICE or to other law enforcement agencies. What was interesting about our law previously is there was an immigration extortion statute, but it required a thing of value. And that actually makes it different from the normal extortion statute. Normal extortion, essentially you could extort somebody by threatening them or coercing them to either do an unlawful act or to refrain from doing a lawful act. So for example, reporting to law enforcement that you hadn't been paid your wages. If you threaten them not to report to law enforcement, that's a lawful act, that's extortion. But if you did so with saying that you were going to report their immigration status, that under the immigration subsection was not a crime because the immigration subsection required some additional thing of value. And it wasn't entirely clear that the work that had already been performed would be enough to sustain that thing of value required by the law. So what we were able to do in House Bill 21-1057 was to change the immigration extortion statute to really mirror the normal extortion statute, which says that if you threaten somebody or coerce them not to do a lawful act or force them to do an unlawful act for some gain on your part, in my example, not paying them the wages that they are owed and threatening them not to pay the wages that are owed and to contact law enforcement. That now is a crime in line with general extortion. So it really lines those two up. We see that a lot within the labor trafficking context, and that's why that was a priority bill for both my office, and we were able to get the entirety of the Colorado District Attorney's Council, the 22 elected DAs, to unanimously support that, and ultimately got near unanimous support throughout the entire legislative process to have that change. I'll note quickly with that, outside of the labor trafficking and human trafficking realm, that's also one that significantly helps our domestic violence victims. I know a lot of folks that are in the anti-human trafficking realm also work in the domestic violence context. And within that realm, what we would see is perpetrators of domestic violence threatening the victim not to call law enforcement, or that they would report their immigration status or something else against them if they were to report the domestic violence allegations. Again, that didn't fully fit within the statute. This change to statute this year now aligns that and allows that to fit within the context of extortion. So that was certainly a good change. Another one that we see within our victims in the criminal justice system is the ability to apply for a U visa. Within the human trafficking context, there's also a T visa. There's about 3 visas that apply. I'm certainly not an expert in all of them. There's some labor and folks, labor attorneys that are better in that, and certainly Colorado Legal Services is better on some of those, including the T visa specifically for human trafficking. But one that we have for victims of crimes generally, including human trafficking or other offenses that are within that realm, is the U visa within the federal system, the federal immigration policy. What happened with U visas is, in order for somebody to apply for a U visa, they have to get a certification by a law enforcement official. That could be a police agency, that could be a DA's office, or it could even be a judge. Those are typically delineated. Judges rarely do them. It typically is either going to be law enforcement or DA's offices, depending on how far the case went involving that victim. So if it was filed with the DA's office, it's the DA's office that has to do that certification. And in the 20th Judicial District, that's me as the designated representative that certifies those applications. If it doesn't get filed with the DA's office, usually it's law enforcement. Well, what we saw is that various law enforcement agencies or district attorney's offices were not certifying U visa applications just as a matter of policy, not because they weren't saying the person was a victim, not because there was any issue with a particular victim. They just said, as a matter of policy for their offices or their agencies, they would not certify U visas based on whatever view could be their view of immigration policy, et cetera. The Colorado State Legislature essentially said, which is true, that the U visa certification does not grant status to any individual. It does not grant them legal status. It does not grant them the U visa. It simply is one step in the process for federal officials to look at the application and to determine if somebody should get a U visa to allow them some lawful status because they are a victim within the criminal justice system. The Colorado State Legislature this year essentially said, you can't just do it as a matter of policy. You need to look at the application, and if you deny the application, you need to have a specific reason for that, and it needs to be in writing. And they also put forth timeframes in which these applications need to be reviewed and either certified or denied by a law enforcement agency or a district attorney's office, because obviously these can significantly impact somebody's immigration status and their ability to go through federal processes. With that, I'll say as an aside for folks that may be working with victims and who may be involved or talking to them about U visa applications, another thing that's new under the current federal administration is U visas, even after law enforcement or DA's offices certified these law enforcement certifications for the application, these would sit for years. Somebody did not get any sort of lawful status or any kind of rights or employment rights, et cetera, until a U visa was ultimately granted, if it was granted. The current administration has said that because of that backlog in U visas, they will expedite what's called a bona fide application process, so that if somebody has fulfilled the application process, including the U visa certification from law enforcement or DA's offices, and there's an initial review that shows this is a bona fide application and that on face value currently they are a victim of a qualifying crime, that person can get some lawful status. It doesn't grant them long-term status, but it does give them some employment rights, so that while this lengthy process takes place, they are able to work legally and get some form of legal rights and legal status within this country. So that was House Bill 21-1060, which was passed by the General Assembly and signed by the governor. Another one that we see as it's related to minor sex trafficking was House Bill 21-1069, which was enforcement of sexual exploitation of a child. Essentially what that did is within the idea of sexual exploitation of a child, and I'll say every time I talk about that statute, it's a bit of a misnomer, because of course we know from those of us working in the field that there's many ways to exploit a child, and essentially sexual assault of a child is sexual exploitation. Human trafficking of a minor is sexual exploitation. But really the definition in Colorado when we're talking about sexual exploitation of a child in large part deals with child pornography or video or explicit images. So explicit video, explicit images of a child within the sexual context. That's sexual exploitative material and sexual exploitation of a child. That statute had not been updated in many years, so it did not include ideas of new technology, new ways to access information. The idea that you don't need to download something. Something may not, something may appear on your computer, and people used to say, well, you know, it just automatically downloaded, and they try to use that as a defense. It allowed for an update to the statute to really change the statute regarding evolving technology and different ways to access and view this sexually exploitative material of a child. It also increased the penalties for sexual exploitation of a child to make it an extraordinary risk crime within the state of Colorado. That increases the sentencing range a little bit within, if we're talking about somebody that receives a prison sentence for sexual exploitation of a child. It also included a surcharge for offenders who are convicted of sexual exploitation of a child to create a fund within CBI and the Department of Public Safety for the state that allows law enforcement agencies to access this fund to help them investigate and assist their investigations into sexual exploitation of a child. Where that comes into play is these investigations require some technical expertise that when you're talking about smaller law enforcement agencies, rural law enforcement agencies, they didn't necessarily have the expertise or sometimes even the technical capability in terms of computer capabilities to investigate and adequately deal with these crimes. That surcharge creates a fund that allows them access to get some assistance from CBI and also access those funds for some of that technical work that they need to do. House Bill 21-1194 created an immigration legal defense fund. Again, a lot of the victims that we see, certainly not all or necessarily even the majority, but when we look at our victims, we look at populations that are vulnerable, including children, including people that have immigrated here recently, whether they have legal status or not, they can be vulnerable to traffickers. So the Colorado General Assembly created a defense fund within the Department of Labor and Employment that allows for nonprofits to apply for this funding source so that they can assist individuals going through the immigration process, including those individuals that maybe have been exploited or trafficked by various individuals. It currently was only funded at the amount of $100,000 for the next fiscal year, so it's not a huge fund. It's something that they intend currently to increase in future years, but also made clear that these nonprofits can have other individuals provide money to the fund outside of state funding that allows individuals or nonprofits to access this funding to help them represent individuals in immigration proceedings. Importantly, within that context, it's important to understand, unlike the criminal justice system in the United States, there's no right to legal counsel in immigration proceedings. And so that's where a lot of these nonprofits come into play to just assist these individuals that are going through immigration proceedings, including children that are going through immigration proceedings that don't have a right to counsel. These nonprofits provide that service, and this allows for a fund through the Division of Labor and Employment for that purpose. Another one is Senate Bill 2139, which was elimination of sub-minimum wage employment. Again, in the area of labor trafficking, we had this concern about wage theft or low wages or unlawful wages. Well, we had a system within the state of Colorado, and it exists federally as well, that allows individuals that are hiring folks that may have a disability to pay them sub-minimum wages, with the idea that because they have a disability, they may not work as well or as fast or as hard or whatever. I'm not suggesting I'm adopting this, but this is some of the arguments for it, that allowed for sub-minimum wage employment for individuals by certain companies. That is something where the state of Colorado has said that before July 1st of, I don't know if it was this year or next year, and I apologize. I wrote down this year, but I'm not sure if that's entirely right. But July 1st, either 2021 or 2022, an individual that currently employs somebody that they are paying sub-minimum wages to, they need to hold a federal certificate that allows them to do so, that they have met federal certification guidelines to show that they have procedures and processes in place to employ individuals that maybe have disabilities and to not exploit them and whatever that federal certification requires. So it's allowed currently right now, but only to individuals that hold that certification, and that was not a requirement prior to this bill being passed. And then it also says that by July 1st of 2025, all sub-minimum wage employment for any reason, including for individuals that maybe have a disability, needs to be phased out. And it creates an advisory partnership within the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment to assist with that phase out over the next 4 years of sub-minimum wage employment for individuals in the state of Colorado. The next one, and these next two received a decent amount of media attention, so some of you may be aware of it, but Senate Bill 2173 eliminated the statute of limitations for a civil action for victims against somebody that sexually assaulted them, against the offender. So previously there was a statute of limitations in play. And when we're talking about people that are vulnerable and are sexually assaulted, minors that are sexually assaulted, it takes years for, as many of you know, for them to deal with that trauma and to recover from that, to be able to be in a place where they could even think about filing a civil action. Because of that, the state legislature removed the statute of limitations applicable to civil actions alleging sexual assault, as long as, and a legal principle is you can't pass laws that apply retroactively. So this applies for any civil action where the statute of limitation has not yet run as of January 1st, 2022. So if the statute of limitations has already run, it doesn't apply retroactive. But let's say this happened many years ago and the statute of limitations has not yet run at the time that this bill passed, that statute of limitations is now eliminated. It also will eliminate any future statute of limitations for any event that occurs past January 1, 2022, that there will no longer be a civil statute of limitations. A couple other things that it does, it repeals the statutory damages limit in terms of how much damages can be awarded in a civil action for sexual assault. It also eliminates the restriction on bringing an action against a deceased individual or their estate. So previously, many people, there is a way to file a civil action against somebody's estate after they had passed. There was a prohibition in the state of Colorado that if it was a civil action for sexual assault, you could not go after the estate. Senate Bill 2173 eliminated that restriction against bringing this against somebody's estate once they have passed. Senate Bill 2188 was the Child Sexual Abuse Accountability Act. This is somewhat similar, but really applies as it relates to a civil action against an organization or youth program where the child sexual abuse occurred as part of that program, and the organization knew or should have known about the sexual abuse that was occurring within their organization or within their youth program. What that does is there is no civil statute of limitations after January 1st, 2022, and for any action that occurred between January 1st, 1960 and January 1st, 2022, that civil action must be brought by January 1st, 2025. So it allows any of these actions to be brought in the next 3.5 years that have occurred historically. And starting January 1st of next year, there is no statute of limitations against bringing a civil action against these organizations or youth programs where sex abuse occurred and the organization knew or should have known about the sexual abuse. It also importantly waives sovereign immunity for public entities that operated a youth program. So it's not just against nonprofits or other organizations that are running these programs, but also organizations that are running these as part of municipalities or under state guidelines or as a state organization. It waives sovereign immunity, so a civil action can be brought against those organizations and they cannot claim that they're a governmental actor or a public entity and thus avoid liability. If it's against a governmental entity, if it's something that is a public entity, the governmental immunity statutory caps apply, and those apply differently depending on when it happened and when the civil action is being brought, et cetera. If it's against an organization, it's a $500,000 damages cap. If it's against an organization that failed to take any remedial action after they became aware of the sex abuse, it's $1 million damages cap that exists within that Sexual Abuse Accountability Act. A couple last ones that we were tracking is Senate Bill 2187. This is agricultural workers' rights. So going back to what your chair talked about as it related to your symposium that's coming up, and particularly looking at labor trafficking within the agricultural realm. Again, that's a continuum. So even if we're not talking about something that fully fits labor trafficking, there's exploitation and people preying on the vulnerability of some of those workers. With that, it provides certain rights to agricultural workers that did not exist previously. So it prohibits any retaliation against workers that report concerns, go to Division of Labor Employment, go to law enforcement, go to other service providers to seek help. It requires that rules need to be established to govern overtime pay within the agricultural workers realm. The general Fair Labor Standards, as it relates to overtime, did not apply to agricultural workers. So it sets up a framework to start to develop rules and promulgate rules for overtime pay for agricultural workers. It removes the exemption for minimum wage that currently existed within state statute for agricultural workers. But it does establish a separate minimum wage for people that engage in the care of livestock on open range. I'm not an agricultural guy. I'll defer to those of you that maybe know more around that. There was a lot of pushback as it related to kind of that work and that the minimum wage should not apply. It establishes a separate framework for minimum wage within that particular realm of agricultural work. It also allows farm workers to unionize and notes that there are limits in terms of how many hours a day or a week that they could be required to work. And then finally, it created an advisory committee to study how all of this will be implemented and to look for future changes or issues around the implementation that can be reported back to the state legislature. And the last one that we tracked that I was really closely involved in was Senate Bill 21-280, which was bias-motivated crimes. So these are crimes that are against somebody that are motivated based on the person's race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, disability, or sexual orientation. Again, within this realm, we've seen the issue of bias-motivated crimes against these vulnerable workers, against individuals from other countries that are experiencing other forms of exploitations that we're dealing with within the human trafficking realm that are also being subjected to bias-motivated crimes. One of the issues within that statute is that it had to be solely motivated by the person's bias against that that person's protected status, so their race, their national origin. It had to be motivated in the initial instance because of the offender's bias. That created a very high burden and difficult burden for law enforcement and prosecutors to overcome. An example that I use regularly in this realm is that if somebody engaged in, there was a road rage situation, and that's what brought these two individuals into a heated confrontation. But that confrontation escalates because the offender then realizes that they're homosexual, or that they're a different race, or that they are from a different country, and that escalates the confrontation. We could not deal with that as a bias-motivated crime. Senate Bill 280 allowed for what we call mixed motive, and says that if the offense happened in whole or in part because of bias, it allows for a prosecution within this realm. So I know it's a lot. I was talking fast. I wanted to cover all of the things the council had talked about over the last session. I know it gets pretty in-depth and in the weeds, and it probably doesn't impact all of you, or certainly all of the bills I talked about may not apply, but I wanted to kind of cover the gamut, because for labor trafficking folks, service providers, some of those apply more. For sex trafficking service providers, the other set kind of provides a little bit more in terms of context. So with that, I'll kind of stop talking for a minute and open it up to any questions or discussion that folks may have. I'm happy to talk through it more, because I know I was getting kind of deep and into the weeds a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you saw that comment. Christian, thank you for that. Is there any chance that you have like a document of all these written up that we could post to our website to have people be able to see the numbers at some point?
Absolutely. I have sort of a draft document that I'm kind of working off as I'm talking about this. I'm happy to kind of clean that up a little bit, and then I'll provide it to you so that you can post it or share it out with your members. And again, my apologies, I wasn't able to do something more formal in terms of a presentation. I was hoping to maybe put a PowerPoint together, but time got away. So.
No, that's okay. That's great. I'm so glad, as you all who saw Jamie Calcara's comment, I'm glad there are people like you who understand all of these issues. And like reading through legislation, the first time somebody had me look over, like, I don't even remember what bill it was. I read it and I was like, I don't have any idea what that just said to me or what I need to be concerned about. Like it gets in the weeds. If you don't understand legislative talk or how things are written, it's all like a foreign language. So I'm appreciative that there are people like you and Joanne and people that sit on the council and other people that really understand that and take it seriously, because when we don't have legislation that covers all the issues, then we've got to go in and we've got to make changes. And people who understand that need to be the ones that are doing it. We need to listen to survivors. We need to listen to people in our community of what are the issues that are not addressed in legislation, and then how do we move forward and change that legislation or create new legislation. So thank you for being one of those people that understands it and knows how to get in there and write all that stuff. I'm appreciative for your.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. And I will say, the first time I review legislation, I don't get it either.
Yeah.
I'm usually about 3 reviews in before I kind of start wrapping my head around some of the stuff. So I'm right there with you, Julie. But I do appreciate it. And I really appreciate you and Joanne kind of inviting me to talk about this for your folks.
Absolutely.
I do just want to generally give a shout out to Joanne, having worked with her for many years now. I mean, she represents you all and your task force very well within the Human Trafficking Council, and she's great to work with and always a great voice and has great ideas within the state council.
Yeah, I'm very appreciative of her too. Is there anybody here in the room that has a question that you'd like to ask? And you can come up here and talk to him directly, or I can field it for you. Anybody with a question? John?
I don't know if I can talk, Kristen, because you've embarrassed me now. So one of the questions that came up in labor trafficking is that we know that there are people out there who are working for a set rate every month. And instead of getting that agreed upon amount, the people who they're working for take out the money for food and housing, and sometimes they're left without anything or deficit. What have we done to change that in legislation? Because I think we made a little headway this last.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, Joanne. So that is a significant issue, and it kind of falls within 2 realms. It certainly could fall in the realm of violating the labor trafficking statute or human trafficking for involuntary servitude statute in the state of Colorado, depending on how it's done. If it's being done in the form of sort of debt bondage is the term of art that we use within the labor trafficking statute, where they're essentially saying, you owe this debt that you're continually paying off and you're really never paying it down. That creates a labor trafficking issue. If, however, it's not starting out that way, but to your point and your example, I think more goes towards a wage theft type of circumstance where somebody has an agreed upon wage, but then, there's sort of this back end bamboozling of, okay, well, yeah, here's your money, but now let me show you all the deductions I'm taking out. If that's not clear and agreed upon up front, that could fit wage theft. And I think also importantly, where that fits wage theft and potentially labor trafficking is when we see those situations, quite frankly, it's fair to say that, I provided you, housing, I provided you food, that sort of thing, but it needs to be done at a fair rate. So the problem is you're not paying somebody a fair rate to start with for their labor, which is a problem that we need to look at within wage theft. And then also importantly, what we see in that realm is they're not charging a fair rate for the food or the shelter, the housing, et cetera. So what I've seen is, they have 7 individuals sharing a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment and are charging each one of those individuals $500 to $700 a month rent. Well, obviously that is completely illegal. That's not fair market value of the rent. And that does fit within the wage theft statute. that we can now prosecute that we were able to bolster just a couple of years back. Again, it's always tricky and very fact specific if that will rise to the level of a labor trafficking prosecution, but that was why bolstering wage theft became important, because we found so many of these were falling through the cracks because they just didn't quite meet the definition of labor trafficking. But now a lot of these we're able to deal with within the wage theft context. But you're right, that is a significant problem that has been identified, and I think we are making some headway.
Thank you.
Okay, Liana, I think you have some questions for us from our online attendees.
I do. I have a number of questions. So first I wanted to ask Julie if we have, as far as what our time constraint is. So if I should ask all of those or just select a few.
How many do you have?
I have 9.
How do you all feel about that? Well, if people need to leave, if you need to leave, if you're online and you need to check out, please feel free to do so. Christian, I guess I need to ask you, do you have time for about 9 questions, or should we narrow those down?
Sure, I think we should be able to hit those. I'm happy to. I'll try to not be a lawyer and talk for too long.
Okay.
Great. Thank you for your willingness, Christian. Yeah. First one, does the statute of limitations begin when the case is brought or when the act occurred?
Great question. So the statute of limitation begins when the act occurred, and the statute of limitation stops at the time that the civil lawsuit is brought. So when we talk about the statute of limitations, it really starts running at the time of the act. And then whenever it's filed, that's the relative time frame. So if there is a time limit, like there was historically, that was the time frame that we were looking at. But the nice thing about the 2 statutes that I talked about, the changes this session, is it eliminates that going forward.
Thank you. We did receive a question asking for a clarification about the bill number on one of the ones you addressed, but I just want to confirm, it sounds like you will be providing a document that we can post to our website that will summarize all of this, so it'll answer all of those.
Yes, it will, and it will have the bill numbers and bill title with it.
Okay, great, thank you. All right. Next, it says choice of court-related statute solution versus, say, Colorado Works Program statute to protect domestic violence victims already in existence, i.e. staff change, but work is still done. So I'm reading that word for word. I don't know if that's, if there's clarity in that.
I apologize. I'm not necessarily following that, but if the person who typed that question, if you all are okay, if that person could unmute themselves, I'm happy to try and address it. I'm just not quite sure I'm following based on the typed question.
Or Leona, if you can put that in the chat to where he can see it and read it, that would be helpful also.
Okay.
It's me, if that's all right. No? Can you hear me?
Sure. Kirsten, it looks like, yeah, if you want to explore that, I'm happy to answer it.
Okay, so my general thought process is that I feel like we have more laws than people know exist and how to protect themselves with it. And then that puts an overabundance of responsibility on law enforcement. And then that just kind of gets through the court system. And so I was asking how many, whenever I hear about a new legislative law coming through, I sit there and go, do we need it? Or can we use what is already in existence? And I only know about Colorado Works Program because I had to look it up for my own divorce case. And there's a whole statute within, or, a line item that covers women that are domestically abused and how they are to notify other victims of the same perpetrator, or whatever the correct word is. And then they're given a certain amount of monetary and civil support. And to me, that can be kind of mixed together with what we're trying to do. I just don't know how many people know it exists and how it can be leveraged without having to always go back to a judge.
No, I think that's a good point. Certainly, we try to be judicious, if you will, when we talk about legislative changes and to say, is this necessary? And then if it's a change that we've identified, but something already exists in statute, we go into that area of statute and try to amend that versus create a new law. I think, the ones that we've talked about really kind of fall outside of that idea of, and I don't know the details of Colorado Works, I apologize, but it goes outside that realm of, domestic violence and outside the realm of kind of within the worker context. What we're talking about more is the labor trafficking context. We're talking about the sex abuse context. There is some of this that does have some overlap with domestic violence and with sexual harassment. But I think that piece goes real directly in that area where we're looking more at labor issues and sex assault issues.
Okay, thank you.
All
Sure.
right. Next question. How does the word get out about this new legislation?
Great question. So it depends on which legislation and what field people are in. So, obviously for me, being a prosecutor and working with law enforcement, we do training every year on legislative updates, both for prosecutors, and then I go out and I train my local law enforcement on legislative updates so folks are aware of it. When we're talking about businesses, when we're talking about nonprofit organizations, service providers, it typically is done through associations that they're a part of. So to give an example that was talked about tonight, like the illicit massage parlor situation that's going to be addressed in your symposium. There is the Colorado Massage, I don't know the exact name of the organization, but the head of it actually is in Colorado Springs. There's organizations within these various businesses that kind of collaborate together, and they tend to be the folks that monitor legislation, advocate for legislation within that group, and then pass legislation back on to their member organizations.
Thank you. You referenced I think the phrase did know or should have known. How much does should have known cause challenges in leveraging damages against organizations or individuals?
Great question. It's definitely an issue of proof for the survivor, plaintiff, or plaintiff's attorney to be able to show what happened and why the organization should have known. Essentially, and I don't want to get into the weeds on this, but the courts use what's called a reasonable person standard or a reasonable organization standard. So it doesn't say that necessarily that particular organization should have known based on the way they operated, but ultimately that a reasonable organization working in their capacity should have known. And then there needs to be some proof about why they should have known. So, was something said? Did they have concerns about this person that were sort of undercurrent within the organization? Did they know that, for example, that youth that were a part of this youth program always stayed away and said they didn't want to work with or be alone with a particular individual? That's a good fact for saying that organizations should have known something was wrong and should have done something or should have investigated. So it is true that it presents challenges, but I think with that reasonable person standard, that's what allows folks to find evidence that helps prove that.
Great, thank you. I think we'll wrap it up there. I think you've hit on a couple of the other questions in your answers to the questions. So thank you very much. So I will turn it back over to you, Julie.
Oh, sorry, guys, I was unmuted. Mhm. Christian, I don't know if you could hear that. How does sexting fall under, do you remember which statute it was? the exploitation of minors, how does that work with sexting when people are passing along pictures?
That is a great question. So the General Assembly put a carve out about sexting amongst minors and kind of consensual sexting. I don't remember exactly when, but I'll say generally a handful of years ago, because ultimately what we had as law enforcement and prosecutors to deal with it was really only the sexual exploitation statute, which is a serious felony. Now, prosecutors and law enforcement weren't convicting individuals of that serious class 4, class 5 felony, but we're using that for the juveniles to get them treatment, get them into classes, and then dismissing the case. So while I think intentions were good, the concern, rightfully so, is that ultimately having a class 3 or class 4 felony hanging over an individual didn't make sense to do intervention when we're talking about a juvenile and we're talking about consensual act between the two folks. So there is a carve out specifically for sexting that makes it a civil infraction on some realms, so that folks can do something about it because it does exist in the law, but it's not really a criminal punishable offense. There are some that then become misdemeanor level punishable offenses, but they are not dealt with within the sexual exploitation realm, unless we're talking about non-juveniles, non-consensual action. So for example, if we're talking about an adult that coerces a juvenile to send sexually exploitative material or child pornography to that adult, that ultimately could fall within the realm of sexual exploitation because of the way it happens.
Right.
So would that fall under the statute if you're not, if it's to one person, but that one person then starts to share it with other people?
Is what you're asking, is that person that then shares that material, are they able to be punished or charged, or is that what you're asking?
Yes, just how to motivate people not to do that, right? Not to share, whatever, or just
Right. So did you hear that at all?
I wasn't able to, sorry.
Trying to expand on if the two original participants, someone took a picture of themselves and they sent it to somebody, and then the person who received that picture then shares, and the person who received that picture then shares, is that punishable for those people that then shared it further?
Gotcha. That's a great question. So again, if we're talking within the juvenile realm, so for example, we see this in high schools where somebody initially gets it consensually, a boyfriend gets it consensually from a girlfriend, and then the boyfriend shares it with one or two of his buddies, and then his buddies share it out, and then it becomes this firestorm. It would be punishable within the sexting context in that example, but not necessarily as child pornography or sexually exploitative material under the felony context. Now, if, for example, however, that gets published onto the internet and somebody is then downloading that as child pornography, some adult not connected in any way with the sexting or the sharing of the information, and it's part of a broader realm of child pornography that they have, it would be included within one of the images or videos that would be part of the prosecution for sexual exploitation of a child.
Okay. Yeah. And then I think she was talking more on prevention as well. I think that's all. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say the prevention piece is huge. And that was one of the things that when we did change that law a handful of years ago, we wanted to make sure that we were still dealing with this from a responsive aspect, both in terms of response if it happens, but definitely from a preventative aspect. And I know there's a lot of organizations that are doing sort of work in this realm. I know a lot of schools that will talk about this and invite presentations. For example, I've been to a couple different high schools of the larger high schools in Boulder to specifically talk about sexting and some of these concerns and why it's something we need to deal with.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I think we will consider this a wrapped up meeting. Christian, thank you so much for giving us your time and going over. You've been with us for a very long time this evening. I'm appreciative that you joined us and for your knowledge and your experience in this field.
Yeah,
It's-
thank you all so much. And thank you all so much for all the work that you're doing and the time that you're putting into this. It's
Absolutely.
important.
Absolutely. Everybody will be back next month. There is possibly a survey that's going to come out from us so that you can let us know how we can do this